Parshas Seitzei, almost at the very end, talks about weights and measures. Lo yelecha b'kischa even va'even gedola uktana. You shall not have in your bag, literally, a stone and a stone, large and small. So we have to figure out what that means. What does it mean, a stone and a stone, large and small? And there's a similar, parallel type of expression in the next verse. Lo yelecha b'veischa efa ve'efa gedola uktana. You shall not have in your house a measure and a measure, large and small. The next verse, Tesvav, we're in 25 now, 25:15. Even shlema v'tzedek yelach. You shall have a perfect and just weight. Okay. Efa shlema v'tzedek yelach. So you should have a perfect and just measure. Lama'an ya'arichu yamecha al ha'adama asher Hashem elokecha nosen lach. So that your days may be long in the land that Hashem gives you. And then finally, the final verse on this subject is Ki sa'avas Hashem elokecha kol ha'se'ela. For it is an abomination to God, all who do these things, kol ha'se'avel, all who act corruptly or do unrighteous things. So there are a number of questions we can ask about these verses. First of all, the Psukim talk about where these weights should be and where these measures should be. The first verse that discusses weights says, Lo yelecha b'kischa, shouldn't be in your pocket, even va'even, a stone and a stone. And the next verse says, Lo yelecha b'veischa efa ve'efa, it shouldn't be in your house, a measure and a measure. So let's talk about even va'even and efa, and then we'll go back to this. What's even va'even? So literally it means a stone and a stone. The Meforshim read it to mean diverse or even contradictory weights. A stone is a weight. For those of you who are old enough to remember having shopped or at least toured Machne Yehuda, the Shuk in Yerushalayim, I don't think they have them anymore. They have weights and they have scales, but they're electronic. In the old days, they would have balance scales that the seller, the balabas, would put weights in grams usually on one side, and he would measure out whatever commodity or nuts or berries or fruit or whatever he was selling on the other side. And when the scales were balanced, then he knew, or you knew, that you were getting the correct measure of produce. So the Mefarshim say that you can't have inconsistent weights. What does that mean? Well, it does not mean, and this goes back to the Medrash Halacha. It doesn't mean you can't have different weights, that you can't have a liter and half a liter, for example. But rather, it means you can't have something that you market or you represent or is labeled as having being of a certain weight, and then having another one labeled the same way, but it's a different weight. And why would you do that? So Rashi says, Gedola shemakresha sesaktana, the large one which is inconsistent, contradicts the small one. Shelo yehe notel b'gedola machzir b'ktana. Shouldn't buy or take with the large. In other words, he wants a kilo of pistachio nuts. So if he's buying pistachio nuts and he weighs them out, so with a large kilo weight, and then there's a small kilo weight, but aren't they both kilos? Well, they both are represented to be kilos, but they're not identical, and that's a problem. So the Torah is saying that you can't use different measures for your benefit, buying with the larger measure and selling with the smaller for what is purportedly the same unit. And this applies to not only to weights, but also to measure. Ephah is a dry measure. And then the next verse, the verse Tesvav 15 says, Even shlema v'tzedek yelach. So it should be consistent and it should be accurate. So you have two issues with weights and measures. Number one is you shouldn't use different weights, different measures for buying and selling. In other words, to your advantage. If it's to your advantage when you buy to have a larger, a heavier stone, and to your advantage to sell with a smaller one, so you're keeping more goods for yourself. But then there's also an obligation. So that's a measure. That's the nature of inconsistency. This is an observation of the Netziv. That's a measure of inconsistency. But then there's also a measure of accuracy, which is that whatever stone you do have, whatever measure you do have, should be accurate. And then this culminating verse says, "To'avas Hashem Elokecha kol oseh ela kol oseh ovel." It is an abomination to God, all those who do this, all those who act corruptly. So you might say that this is that kol oseh ela, those who do these things, means those who do in fact have inconsistent weights and measures and inaccurate weights and measures. And then the last phrase says kol oseh ovel, those who act unrighteously or corruptly. Rabbi Menachem Sachs actually explains that kol oseh ela in this could be read to mean not talking about the weights and measures, but rather it is an abomination, especially for people who do kol oseh ela, the other things that preceded all of the mitzvos that the Parsha talks about earlier on. And then, in other words, person acts in a way that's appropriate when it comes to doing mitzvahs, but when it comes to business, he cheats. And that is a to'eva, that is an abomination to Kadosh Baruch Hu. We kind of sense this in our community also. It's always a big scandal, appropriately, when somebody who appears to be righteous, appears to be pious, appears to be frum, and cheats. It is particularly galling, it's particularly humiliating and embarrassing, not only for the individual, but for the Jewish people as a whole. And this is the reading of Rabbi Menachem Sachs and Menachem Tzion, pointing out that this is the abomination. The abomination is not simply acting like a thief or inappropriately, but acting in a way that's inconsistent with your other activities, which are those of a righteous individual. Now, this goes back to another reading of these verses, and this focuses on a more representative reading of having inconsistent weights and measures. There's having it in your pocket, having it in your house. What does that mean? In other words, sometimes people act in public one way that is calculated, either consciously or subconsciously, to create an impression of an honorable impression, an impression of a person doing the right thing. And yet, when it comes to acting in private, in their home or in their pocket, as it were, they act corruptly. And the inconsistency is a problem. And this, we've talked about it in the past. This is something that Rabbi Gamliel was particularly sensitive to in the Beis HaMedrash. It's related in the Gemara and Brachos about somebody being tocho kabaro, that his inside should be like his outside, meaning that he should be a consistent person. If he appears to be righteous, then he's got to be righteous through and through. It's a very high standard. There's also a question of when you evaluate others, and this is on taking it to a somewhat more abstract level, but very practical, especially in today's times. When you evaluate others, make sure that you're evaluations are based on principles that you apply consistently. And it is not infrequent that we judge people more harshly than we would judge ourselves in a given situation. There's an excellent book called Thanks for the Feedback, which talks about how to assimilate criticism. One might call it based on the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, in Perek Vav, Mishnah Vav, one of the 48 ways of Kinyan Torah, 48 ways to wisdom, as Rabbi Noach Weinberg would call them, is Ohev es hatochachos, somebody who loves reproof. And this book, Thanks for the Feedback, is really kind of a guide on how to love reproof and how to accept criticism, even if it's given poorly. So one of the things that the authors point out is that as a result of research that they've done, that people evaluate themselves by different standards than they evaluate others. And it gives as an example somebody who shows up late for a meeting, the people who are at the meeting, who are the, let's call them the victims or the inconvenienced of the late arrival, will frequently attribute the failure of the individual to show up punctually to a moral failing. Moral failure, the person lacks integrity, is not considerate, can't be bothered to consider others in his timing, etc. Whereas the individual who's late has an excuse. His excuse is traffic, getting kids off to school, kids were sick, he was sick, he had a pressing phone call, etc. In other words, it's a circumstantial excuse. And the Torah actually requires, the halacha is that we have to resolve these issues. We have to be done l'kav schus. We have to resolve them favorably towards an individual. And it could be that that what this means is that we have to apply the same standard to others as we apply to ourselves. This may be an expression of the mitzvah of the Ohavta l'reacha kamocha. You should love your neighbor or your fellow as yourself, which Rabbi Kiva says is klal gadol b'Torah, which means that it applies throughout the Torah. It underlies perhaps all of the Torah and certainly many of the mitzvos, if not all of them. And it viewed through this lens, what we're talking about is being consistent. You love yourself. You judge yourself favorably. You must use the same standards that you use for yourself when you evaluate others. Alan Dershowitz uses this argument, not with this formulation, but he talks about the double standard when it comes to evaluating Israel, that the people who bash Israel and criticize Israel for all kinds of activities don't criticize other countries that commit acts that are far worse than Israel. And he says that's a key to identifying criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism. So the notion is, number one, consistency, and number two, accuracy. These are goals that we must strive for. These are goals that the Torah sets out as being the hallmark of the Jewish people. Have a good Shabbos.